They didn't arrest him because he leaked secrets, they arrested him because he proved they existed. February 18, 1977. London. Cold rain cuts sideways through a quiet North London street as a 25-year-old journalist steps out of a townhouse coat collar pulled up heart racing. In his pocket is a cassette tape, not a bomb, not stolen documents, not classified codes, just 3 hours of recorded testimony. But what's on that tape is enough to terrify a government. He takes 14 steps. 14. Then the shadows move. Men in dark coats emerge without warning. Badges flash under streetlights. Hands seize his arms, wrench them behind his back. Metal cuffs snap shut around his wrists. Special branch. He's charged under the Official Secrets Act, accused of treason, facing up to 14 years in prison. For asking questions. For listening. For doing his job. In a democracy that claims to value free speech, a journalist has just been treated like a foreign spy. Each raid, each seizure, each threat confirmed what no official statement ever would. He wasn't imagining a hidden architecture, he was standing too close to it. And once the state decides you're not just wrong but dangerous, the conflict changes. It stops being about truth versus lies. It becomes about endurance. About whether a single individual can keep going once the full weight of power begins to press down. When Duncan Campbell finally put the pieces together and published what he had found, he expected resistance. What he didn't expect was indifference. Somebody's listening landed not with an explosion, but with a dull thud. The system he described was vast, invasive, and deeply unsettling, yet the public reaction was muted. Governments issued flat denials or said nothing at all. No press conferences, no detailed rebuttals, just silence. It was a calculated move. Arguing would legitimize the claims. Prosecuting again would draw attention. So power chose the most effective weapon it had, left pretending nothing had happened. For Campbell, this was the most psychologically brutal phase of the fight. Years of work had culminated in a truth that should have been impossible to ignore. Yet it drifted through public consciousness like science fiction. The scale was too large, the implications too abstract. People couldn't see the harm, couldn't feel it in their daily lives, so they moved on. Meanwhile, inside intelligence agencies, the reaction was anything but calm. Panic stayed behind closed doors. Meetings were held. Damage assessments quietly circulated. An outsider had mapped their crown jewel. But acknowledging him publicly would mean admitting the unthinkable, that for decades democratic governments had lied to their own citizens. So they waited, and the waiting worked. Without outrage, there was no reform. Without reform, the system remained intact. Campbell continued speaking, writing, warning, becoming a familiar but easy to dismiss figure, the man obsessed with something officials swore didn't exist. This was the true consequence of exposure without accountability. Not punishment, not vindication, but a hollow space where change should have been. The most dangerous realization came slowly. A truth can be proven, documented, even published, and still fail to matter. And once a society accepts that the balance of power shifts permanently, because a surveillance system doesn't need secrecy forever. It only needs people to stop caring. The shift didn't begin with outrage, it began with money. For years, Duncan Campbell's warnings were easy to dismiss as abstract fears about privacy and hidden power. But in the mid-1990s, the consequences of surveillance stopped being theoretical and started showing up on balance sheets. European industries began losing contracts they were supposed to win. Negotiations collapsed with uncanny precision. Competitors seemed to know strategies before they were ever announced. The Airbus-Boeing scandal cracked the facade wide open. Intelligence agencies weren't just listening in the name of security, they were feeding intercepted communications into economic warfare. That revelation changed the rules. Surveillance was no longer a distant civil liberties concern. It was a direct assault on sovereignty, jobs, and national competitiveness. European lawmakers could tolerate secrecy. They could tolerate embarrassment. They could not tolerate being outplayed in their own markets by an ally spying from above. Suddenly, the questions Duncan had been asking for decades were no longer fringe. In 1998, the European Parliament commissioned an official investigation, and for the first time, the outsider was invited inside. Campbell was no longer the man shouting into the void. He was a primary source. His work became the backbone of the STOA report, a dense, unflinching document that did what governments had refused to do. It named the system, mapped its reach, and confirmed its existence in formal language. When Campbell testified in Brussels in 2001, the atmosphere was electric. Skepticism gave way to unease, then anger. Satellite photographs replaced denials. Declassified documents replaced assurances. By the time the hearings concluded, the truth was unavoidable. Echelon was real. Mass interception was happening. And for the first time, power had been forced not to confess, but to listen. For a brief moment in 2001, it looked like the story had an ending. A hidden system had been exposed, validated by elected officials, and formally condemned. Duncan Campbell, once dismissed as paranoid, had been proven right at the highest levels of democratic government. But history rarely ends when the truth comes out. Sometimes that's when it becomes most vulnerable. On September 11th, the world changed, and with it, the moral framework that had briefly allowed skepticism to breathe. Fear rushed in where accountability had just begun to form. Surveillance, once a scandal, was reborn as necessity. Questions about privacy were reframed as luxuries. Limits became obstacles. The Echelon system didn't retreat after exposure, it adapted. It moved from satellites to fiber optic cables, from phone calls to metadata, from targeted interception to the full digital exhaust of everyday life. What Duncan had uncovered was no longer hidden. It was normalized. Years later, when Edward Snowden revealed the scale of modern surveillance, the shock wasn't that governments were listening. It was how vast, automated, and permanent the listening had become. Snowden's documents didn't contradict Campbell's work, they completed it. The same architecture expanded, the same logic perfected. Today, the legacy of that early investigation lives quietly in the background of modern life. Every message sent, every search typed, every movement logged. The system no longer needs secrecy to survive. It survives on resignation. Duncan Campbell proved that one person can uncover the truth even against immense power. But his story leaves a harder lesson behind. Winning the argument doesn't mean winning the future. Because the most enduring systems aren't protected by lies, they're protected by the moment people decide that knowing is enough and acting is too costly. This story isn't just about surveillance. It's about power comfort and the quiet trade we make between convenience and control. Duncan Campbell showed us that freedom rarely disappears overnight. It erodes, slowly normalized, one system at a time, until oversight feels unnecessary and resistance feels pointless. The warning isn't that someone is watching. The warning is how easily we learn to live with it. In a democracy, the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of questions. If this story made you think, hit like. If you believe others should hear it, share. And if you want more investigations like this, subscribe. The next chapter is already unfolding. But here's the part. No one in that street understands, yet the arrest is already pointless. The tape is only the beginning. Because what this journalist has uncovered isn't a single scandal or rogue operation. It's a hidden architecture of power sprawling across the planet, humming quietly above our heads and beneath our conversations. A system built by 5 allied governments, denied for decades, designed to listen to everyone. Not suspects, not enemies, everyone. From white radar domes rising out of the English countryside, to satellite dishes buried in the Australian desert, to silent facilities in New Zealand farmland and mountain bunkers in the United States. This network is pulling hundreds of millions of private communications out of the air every single day. Phone calls, faxes, emails, data vacuumed up, filtered, stored. The governments behind it swear it doesn't exist. They always have. But the man in handcuffs knows better. His name is Duncan Campbell, and what he's about to expose will force an uncomfortable question that still haunts us today. What happens when the greatest threat to privacy isn't a dictator or a hacker, but the very democracies we're told are protecting us? What Duncan Campbell was circling wasn't a shadowy conspiracy run by a handful of men in dark rooms. It was something far more unsettling, a system, not emotional, not political, mechanical, relentless. Modern surveillance doesn't begin with suspicion, it begins with capacity. High above the Earth at roughly 22,000 miles in orbit, Geostationary satellites hang motionless over fixed points, silently catching radio, microwave, and telephone signals as they spill into space. They don't care who you are. They don't need a warrant. They simply collect. Below them, listening stations on the ground act like industrial refineries, pulling raw signals down, stripping them apart, sorting them, tagging them, and feeding them into computers designed to search at a scale no human ever could. This isn't detectives listening to phone calls with headphones pressed to their ears. This is bulk interception, everything first, meaning later. 5 countries operate this machinery as a single organism: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Each handles part of the workload, each benefits from the others, each quietly exploits legal loopholes by letting allies spy where domestic laws might forbid it. The result is a surveillance network that feels less like policing and more like logistics Amazon-scale infrastructure applied to human communication. To the system, your voice isn't private or personal. It's data, noise, a signal to be captured, stored, and analyzed if needed, and that's the most dangerous part. Because systems like this don't require bad intentions to become abusive. They only require silence, efficiency, and time. No villain needs to wake up and decide to spy on everyone. The machine does it automatically. It listens because it can. And once a society builds something that powerful, the real question is no longer who it's targeting, it's whether anyone can ever truly turn it off. Duncan Campbell didn't uncover the world's most secret surveillance system by being brave. He uncovered it by being stubborn in a way most people can't afford to be. No insider leaks slid across a cafe table. No anonymous envelopes arrived in the mail. What he had instead was something far less dramatic and far more dangerous to power: time, patience, and a refusal to let inconsistencies go. While other journalists chased headlines that paid quickly, Duncan disappeared into places where stories go to die: government archives, obscure technical journals, budget appendices. No one reads. He studied defense procurement numbers that didn't match public explanations. He compared telecom traffic routes against official narratives. He used his background in physics to calculate where communication satellites had to be positioned to work at all. Again and again, the math told a different story than the government did. Something vast was operating in silence. The deeper he went, the lonelier the work became. Years passed with no public validation, only the steady pressure of being watched, phones clicking, footsteps behind him, the quiet certainty that every move was noted. Then came the moment that changed everything. Peace activists near Menwith Hill, frustrated by their own ignorance, did something radical. They searched the base's trash. From damp, discarded paperwork pulled from dumpsters, Duncan saw what power never expects anyone to look at: the leftovers. Maintenance logs, technical fragments, acronyms without explanations. At first it looked like noise. Then patterns began to emerge. One word surfaced again and again, buried in diagrams and schedules always adjacent to satellite interception systems and international coordination. Echelon. It wasn't announced. It wasn't explained. It simply appeared like a fingerprint repeated across different crime scenes. That was when Duncan understood what he was facing. This wasn't a program. It was an architecture. A global design so normalized inside bureaucracy that no one bothered to hide it carefully anymore. The realization was intoxicating and terrifying. He wasn't chasing rumors, he was reconstructing a machine. And once you see the shape of a system, you can never unsee it. Every new document confirmed the same truth: this network wasn't built for emergencies. It was built to endure. And Duncan knew something else, something colder. If he could see it from the outside, then from the inside they could see him. There is a moment in every investigation when silence becomes the answer. Duncan Campbell reached that moment when the machinery he had been mapping finally turned its attention directly toward him. The response was not debate, not rebuttal, not evidence offered to prove him wrong. It was force, legal force, institutional force, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it already owns the room. The ABC trial was the first clear signal. Proceedings held behind closed doors. Evidence the public was forbidden to hear. A journalist charged not for publishing lies, but for receiving information deemed useful to an enemy. The language was deliberate. It reframed curiosity as betrayal and journalism as a threat to the state itself. And then, in a moment that exposed the rot beneath the performance, the system slipped. A witness referenced a British signals unit in Cyprus, a listening post, so sensitive the judge immediately shut the courtroom down. Names were banned. Details erased mid-sentence. Panic flashed across the prosecutors' faces. That single accidental fragment told Duncan everything. If one base was unspeakable, there had to be many more. Power doesn't fear exposure unless the scale is catastrophic. From that point on, the pressure intensified. His home was searched, his papers seized, years of work treated as contraband. In 1987, when he helped produce a BBC documentary about a secret British spy satellite hidden from Parliament, the retaliation escalated again. Police raided BBC Scotland itself, confiscating film reels as if journalism were an armed insurgency. The message wasn't subtle. This wasn't about correcting errors. It was about deterrence, about showing every reporter watching that some questions carry consequences beyond careers. Duncan understood the psychology instantly. These were not the actions of a confident state. They were the reflexes of a system protecting its core.